The elegant swirling font on the cream-colored menu made the numbers next to the entrees look even more terrifying to Sarah. $85 for a ribeye steak was more than she spent on groceries for an entire week for herself and her daughter. She gripped the leather edges of the menu so tightly that her knuckles turned white, trying to keep her hands from trembling under the table. She had expected a coffee date, or perhaps a walk in Central Park, but when James had texted her the address of La Jardin in Manhattan, she assumed he wanted to impress her. Now, sitting across from him, the situation felt like a cruel joke. James sat slumped in the velvet chair opposite her, wearing a faded gray hoodie that had a small hole near the collar, and scuffed sneakers that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles of rough pavement. The contrast between his attire and the pristine white tablecloth was so jarring that customers at nearby tables were openly staring. A woman in pearls 2 tables away whispered something to her husband, who glanced at James with a look of pure disdain. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and lowered the menu slowly. "Are you finding everything all right?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to maintain a warm smile, despite her rising anxiety. James looked up, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected to be kicked out at any moment. "I am not sorry," James replied, his voice quiet and rough. "I did not realize this place was quite so expensive. I thought it was just a regular diner." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy pierce through her own financial panic. She knew that look of embarrassment all too well because she wore it every time her card was declined at the pharmacy or when she had to put items back at the grocery store checkout. The shame of not belonging was a heavy coat to wear, and James was wearing it right now. "It is okay," Sarah said, leaning forward to bridge the distance between them. "We do not have to order a feast." The appetizers looked lovely. Before James could respond, a shadow fell over their table. The waiter, a tall man with a mustache so sharp it looked drawn on with a marker, stood beside them with his nose turned upward. He did not look at James. He stared pointedly at the empty water glass, refusing to make eye contact with the man in the hoodie. "Have we decided?" the waiter asked, his tone dripping with impatience. "Or do we need more time to calculate if we can afford the water?" The insult was subtle but struck like a slap across the face. Sarah felt heat rise up her neck. She looked at James, expecting him to be angry, but he just shrank further into his seat, pulling the sleeves of his hoodie over his hands. "We will just have 2 waters and the breadbasket for now," James mumbled, staring at the tablecloth. The waiter let out a short, sharp sigh, snatched the menus from their hands without a word, and marched away, his shoes clicking aggressively against the marble floor. Sarah reached across the table, ignoring the dirty looks from the couple next to them, and gently placed her hand on James's forearm. The fabric of his hoodie was rough and worn thin. "Hey, do not let him get to you," Sarah said softly. "Some people measure worth by the cost of their suit, but that does not mean they are valuable." James looked up, and for a second, Sarah thought she saw a spark of something sharp and intelligent in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a shy, grateful smile. "Thank you, Sarah," James said. "It has been a rough year. I lost my job a few months ago and I have been trying to get back on my feet. But interviews are hard when you cannot afford a haircut." Sarah nodded, her heart breaking for him. She calculated the balance of her bank account in her head. She had exactly $140 left for the rest of the month. Rent was paid, but the electric bill was overdue. If she paid for dinner here, she would have to skip lunch for a week, maybe 2. But looking at James, she decided it was worth it. She knew what it was like to need a win. "Tell me about your dream job," Sarah asked, steering the conversation away from the awkwardness. "If you could do anything, what would you do?" For the next hour, they talked. To her surprise, James was articulate, funny, and deeply kind. He listened to her talk about her daughter, about the struggles of single motherhood, and about her dreams of opening a small bakery one day. He did not interrupt. He did not check his phone. He just listened with an intensity that made Sarah feel seen for the first time in years. The spell was broken when the waiter returned. He did not say a word. He simply dropped the black leather folder containing the bill onto the table with a heavy thud and walked away immediately. The silence at the table was deafening. James stared at the black folder as if it were a bomb. He patted his pockets, his face turning a shade of crimson red. He checked the left pocket, then the right, then checked them again. "Oh no," James whispered, his voice cracking. "I think I left my wallet in my other pants." "I am so sorry, Sarah." Sarah watched him panic. This was the moment most women would have walked out. This was the moment the date was supposed to end in disaster. She looked at the bill, then at James's terrified face, and then she made her choice. She reached for her purse. Sarah's fingers tightened around the thin plastic of her debit card as she slid it across the table toward the black folder. The movement felt heavy, like she was pushing a boulder rather than a few ounces of plastic. In her mind, she was frantically rearranging her budget for the month. If she skipped her morning coffee for 3 weeks and canceled the streaming service she used for her daughter's cartoons, she might just make it to the next payday without an overdraft fee. "Please, put that away," James said, reaching out to stop her hand, his voice laced with genuine distress. "I cannot let you do this. This was my idea. I am the one who invited you." Sarah shook her head gently and offered him a reassuring smile, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "It is fine, James," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "We all have moments where we forget things or fall short. It does not define who you are. Besides, I had a really nice time tonight. That is worth more than a dinner bill." James looked at her, his mouth slightly open, stunned by her lack of judgment. He seemed to be searching her face for any sign of resentment or pity, but all he found was a tired kindness. He slowly pulled his hand back, allowing her to place the card inside the folder. The waiter materialized beside the table almost instantly, as if he had been watching them from the shadows, waiting for this specific moment of humiliation. He picked up the leather folder, flipped it open, and saw Sarah's card. His gaze flicked to James, and a smirk curled the corner of his lip. "I see," the waiter said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "The lady is paying." "How very modern of you, sir. I suppose some men prefer to be taken care of." The couple at the next table chuckled. The man in the suit shook his head, muttering something about the decline of chivalry. James looked down at his sneakers, his shoulders hunching forward as if he were trying to make himself disappear into the floorboards. Sarah felt a sudden surge of anger, hot and sharp, rising in her chest. It replaced her financial anxiety instantly. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of half the room. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice firm and clear. The waiter paused, looking at her with raised eyebrows, his smirk faltering slightly. "There is nothing wrong with a woman paying for dinner," Sarah continued, staring him directly in the eyes. "And there's nothing wrong with a man going through a hard time. What is wrong is treating people with disrespect just because you think you are better than them. Please run the card and bring me the receipt." The room fell silent. The waiter's face turned a pale shade of pink. He cleared his throat awkwardly, snapped the folder shut, and hurried away toward the register without another word. 5 minutes later, they were standing on the sidewalk. The night air was biting and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the restaurant. New York City moved around them in a blur of yellow taxis and rushing pedestrians, but the silence between them was heavy. Sarah wrapped her coat tighter around herself, shivering as the wind cut through the thin fabric. She checked her phone. It was getting late, and the babysitter charged by the hour. "I am so sorry about that," Sarah said, turning to face James. "That waiter was a nightmare. Please, do not take what he said to heart." James was standing near the curb, looking at the traffic. He seemed different now. His posture had changed. He was no longer hunched over, stood tall, his spine straight, his chin lifted. He turned to look at her, and the shy, nervous expression was gone, replaced by a calm, intense confidence. "Sarah," James said, his voice deeper and more steady than it had been inside. "You barely know me. You know I am unemployed. You know I have no money. You just spent your last dollar on me, and then you defended me to a room full of strangers. Why did you do that?" Sarah blinked, confused by the sudden change in his demeanor. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep warm. "Because I know what it feels like to be looked down on," Sarah answered simply. "And because kindness is free, James. Even when you are broke, you can afford to be kind." James stared at her for a long moment, studying her face as if he were memorizing it. A small, genuine smile played on his lips. "You are right," James said. "Kindness is rare, and it is valuable." He reached into the pocket of his worn-out hoodie. Sarah expected him to pull out a pack of gum or maybe a tissue. Instead, he pulled out a sleek, black, remote key fob with a prancing horse emblem on it. He pressed a button. Sarah jumped back, startled as the low, aggressive growl of an engine erupted behind her. The headlights of a cherry-red sports car flashed twice, illuminating the sidewalk in a wash of white light. It was a machine of pure luxury, sitting amongst the dirty yellow cabs like a diamond in a pile of rocks. Sarah looked at the car, then back at James, her confusion turning into shock. "He's Taff. Is that yours?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. James stepped forward, the faded gray hoodie suddenly looking like a costume rather than clothing. "Actually," James said, walking toward the passenger door, "the meal was on me. I just needed to know if you were hungry for dinner or hungry for a wallet." The mechanical hiss of the butterfly door opening upward sounded like a spaceship landing, and Sarah instinctively took a step back, nearly tripping over a crack in the pavement. Her brain was struggling to reconcile the two images in front of her. On one side, there was James, the man in the whole-reading hoodie who couldn't afford a bread basket. On the other, there was this gleaming beast of engineering that cost more than the entire apartment building she lived in. "I do not understand," Sarah stammered, her voice breathless as the cold wind whipped her hair across her face. "Is this a rental? Is this some kind of prank show?" James shook his head slowly, a look of solemn apology replacing the confidence on his face. He walked around the car and stood before her, not as a broken man, but as a man in control. He reached up and unzipped the worn-out gray hoodie, pulling it off to reveal a tailored black t-shirt underneath that hugged his frame. "It is not a rental," James said softly. "My name is James Sterling. I am the founder of Sterling Systems." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Sterling Systems was the company that made the software for half the hospitals in the city. She had seen his face on magazine covers at the dentist's office, but in those photos, he was always wearing a tuxedo, clean-shaven, and looking untouchable. Here, in the dim streetlights, with stubble on his chin and messy hair, she hadn't recognized him at all. "Yuli to me," Sarah whispered, a sudden wave of humiliation washing over her. "You sat there and let me worry about the bill. You let me count pennies in my head while you had a Ferrari parked outside. Was this funny to you? Was I just entertainment for a bored billionaire?" Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. Hot and angry, she felt foolish, like a child who had fallen for a mean trick on the playground. She turned to walk away, clutching her cheap purse to her chest as a shield. James moved faster than she expected. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path, his hands raised in surrender. "Please, Sarah, wait," James pleaded, the smooth CEO persona cracking to reveal the lonely man underneath. It was not entertainment. It was desperation. "Do you know how many dates I have been on in the last 2 years?" Sarah stopped, her boots crunching on the wet pavement. She turned back to face him, the rain now falling in steady, cold sheets, plastering her hair to her forehead. James took a step closer, ignoring the water soaking his expensive teeth. 50, James said, his voice straining against the noise of the city. "I have been on 50 dates in the last 2 years. Do you know what happens? As soon as they see the car, or the watch, or they Google my last name, I stop being a person. I become a bank account. I become a trip to Dubai, or a new handbag." He wiped the rain from his eyes, looking at her with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. "Tonight, you were the first person, the only person who looked at a guy in a dirty hoodie and treated him like a human being. You offered to pay with money you clearly needed for yourself. You defended me. You did not want anything from me." Sarah stood there, shivering in the cold. The anger was still there, simmering in her chest, but it was cooling rapidly under the sincerity of his words. She looked at the Ferrari, then back at his pleading eyes. "My life is not a test, James," Sarah said, her voice shaking, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline. "Being broke is not a game. When I saw that bill, I was terrified. I was calculating whether I could afford groceries next week. You have the luxury of playing pretend. I do not." James flinched, as if she had physically struck him. He looked down at his hands, nodding slowly. "You are right," James admitted quietly. "I was so obsessed with protecting myself from being used that I forgot about the collateral damage. I was arrogant, and I am sorry. I am truly, deeply sorry." He reached into the car and pulled out a sleek black umbrella, popping it open and holding it over her head, shielding her from the downpour while he stood in the rain. "Let me take you home," James offered gently. "No strings attached, no dates, just a ride so you do not have to take the subway in the rain. Please, let me do at least that." Sarah looked at the umbrella, then at the warmth glowing from the interior of the car. She was exhausted. Her feet hurt. The subway ride to Queens would take an hour. She looked at James, and for the first time that night, she saw neither the broke failure nor the billionaire tycoon. She just saw a man who had made a mistake and was desperate to fix it. "Okay," Sarah whispered. "Just a ride home." The inside of the car smelled like rich leather and expensive cologne. The engine purred so quietly it was barely audible, a stark difference from the rattling windows of the subway train she was used to. As they merged onto the bridge, leaving the glittering skyline of Manhattan behind, the silence stretched between them again. But this time it wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. James kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2. "Can I ask you something?" James asked, breaking the silence. Sarah turned her head away from the window. "You can ask," she replied. "Why did you really stand up to that waiter? Most people would have just stayed quiet to avoid a scene." Sarah sighed, tracing the stitching on the leather seat with her finger. "Because I know what it looks like when people think you are invisible," Sarah said. "I work as a cleaner at a law firm downtown. I empty trash cans for men in suits who cost more than my annual salary. They walk past me like I am furniture. Tonight, that waiter looked at you the way those lawyers look at me, and I hate that look." James tightened his grip on the wheel. He glanced at her, and she saw a profound respect in his eyes that she had never seen from the men she usually dated. Men who often judged her for her job or her financial struggles. "You are a cleaner?" James asked, surprise coloring his tone. "Yes," Sarah said, bracing herself for the judgment. "It pays the bills. Barely. But it puts food on the table for my daughter." James did not say anything for a long time. He simply drove, his jaw set in a firm line. As they pulled up to her apartment, building a run-down brick complex in Queens with peeling paint and dim street lights there, contrast between the gleaming red Ferrari and the crumbling sidewalk was impossible to ignore. James put the car in park, but didn't unlock the doors immediately. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "You are not invisible, Sarah," James said firmly. "You are the most real person I have met in this entire city." Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She unbuckled her seatbelt, suddenly desperate to escape the intensity of the moment. "Thank you for the ride, James," she said, reaching for the handle. "Good luck finding what you are looking for." "Wait," James said, reaching into the back seat. He handed her a thick, cream-colored business card with a gold-embossed logo, and then he reached into the glove box and pulled out a white envelope. "Take this," James said, pressing the envelope into her hand. Sarah frowned, feeling the thickness of the paper. "What is this?" she asked. "It is the money for the dinner," James said quickly. "Plus a little extra for the Uber you should have taken. Please, do not argue. Consider it a refund for a bad date." Sarah hesitated, then took the envelope. She opened the door, the cold night air rushing in to replace the heated luxury of the car. "Good night, James," she said. "Good night, Sarah," James replied. As she walked up the steps to her building, she heard the engine roar and fade into the distance. Inside her apartment, with hands still trembling, she opened the envelope. It wasn't a few $100s. It was a check for $10,000, and a note that read, "For the person who invested in me when I had nothing." 3 days later, Sarah stood at the base of the Sterling Systems Tower, feeling like an ant looking up at a mountain. The check for $10,000 was still in her purse, folded neatly inside the envelope. She had stared at it for hours the night she received it, crying tears of relief as she imagined paying off her debts, buying her daughter new winter clothes, and finally breathing without the crushing weight of poverty on her chest. But as the initial shock wore off, a different feeling had taken root. It was a gnawing sense of pride that she could not silence. She did not want to be a charity case. She did not want to be the poor woman the billionaire pitied. She pushed through the revolving glass doors, entering a lobby that smelled of expensive espresso and sanitized ambition. Men and women in sharp suits moved with purpose, their heels clicking rhythmically on the polished marble floors. Sarah clutched her purse tighter to her side, feeling the familiar imposter syndrome creeping up her spine, but she forced her legs to move toward the reception desk. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her eyes briefly scanning Sarah's outfit before returning to her computer screen. "I'm here to see James Sterling," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the rapid thumping of her heart. The receptionist paused, a faint, condescending smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Sterling is in meetings all day. Do you have an appointment?" "No," Sarah admitted. "But please, just tell him Sarah's here." "The one from La Jardin." The receptionist sighed, clearly preparing to call security. When the elevator doors behind the desk chimed, a group of executives walked out, and in the center of them was James. He looked completely different from the man in the hoodie. He wore a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was styled, and he exuded an aura of power that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. James stopped mid-sentence, ignoring the CFO who was trying to show him a graph on a tablet. He pushed past the executives and walked straight toward the reception desk, his eyes fixed solely on Sarah. "Sarah," James said, breathless as he reached her. "You came." Sarah pulled the envelope from her purse and held it out to him. "I cannot keep this, James," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is too much. I appreciate the gesture, more than you know, but I did not go on that date for a paycheck." The lobby went quiet. The receptionist stared with her mouth slightly open. The executives watched in confusion. James looked at the envelope, then at Sarah's determined face. He did not take the money. Instead, he smiled, a genuine, boyish smile that reminded her of the guy in the hoodie. "You are not returning that," James said firmly. "But if you are too proud to take it as a gift, then take it as a signing bonus." Sarah blinked, confused. "A signing bonus," she repeated. "I fired my cleaning contractor this morning," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "They were cutting corners and underpaying their staff. I need someone to manage the facility services for this building. Someone who knows the work, someone who respects the people doing the work, and someone who is not afraid to tell the truth, even when it is uncomfortable." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I need someone real, Sarah. My world is full of people pretending to be something they are not. You are the only real thing I have found. Will you take the job?" Sarah felt the floor sway beneath her. This wasn't a handout. It was an opportunity. It was a chance to use her experience, her grit, and her integrity to build a life she actually wanted. She thought of her daughter, and for the first time in years, the future didn't look like a dark tunnel. It looked bright. She looked at James, seeing the hope in his eyes. "I will take the job," Sarah whispered, smiling through fresh tears. "On one condition." James raised an eyebrow, grinning. "Name it." "Next time we go for dinner," Sarah said, a playful spark returning to her eyes. "We go for pizza, and we split the bill." James laughed, a loud, happy sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Deal. Essaye." As they walked together toward the elevators, leaving the confused receptionist and the stunned executives behind, Sarah realized that the waiter at the restaurant had been wrong about everything. Worth wasn't about the price of the suit or the limit on the credit card. It was about the character beneath the clothes. She had walked into that restaurant expecting a free meal, but she walked out with a future. And James, who had everything money could buy, finally found the one thing he couldn't purchase. A woman who loved him for exactly who he was, hoodie and all.